Hello and welcome to Module 2. Congratulations on completing Module 1. I did just finish providing you feedback on the assignments for Module 1, so please make sure you take a look at that feedback. We'll talk about it a little bit more at the end, but on that feedback I made comments, talked about where you lost points. In some of those points, if you take a look at that feedback, make the changes for next week, you can reduce some of the points lost possibly. So please make sure you take a look at that. All right, for today we are going to be talking about a few different things. The first, we're going to do a very brief overview of child development. That is one of our objectives for the course, and so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that or introducing some of that today. We will continue to talk about it over the next few modules. And then we're going to focus on the family's influence on delinquency and the school's influence on delinquency. Then lastly, we're going to talk about a risk and needs assessment tool called the YLSI that I get really, really excited about. So let's go ahead and jump right in. That's a pretty hefty agenda, so I want to get moving on it. As an introduction to child development, one of the things that we have learned through research and a lot of things through child psychologists is ultimately ages 1 to 3 is the most critical of child development. And we say that because ultimately this is when children begin to develop their conscience and also learn about consequences and how consequences can be both positive as well as negative. It is during this time frame that children have the most brain cell development, more so than any other stage of their life. This is also when kids are learning basic conflict resolution, what we might call normal conflict resolution, on how to manage some differences. One of the things that kind of makes me crazy, and again, I think I talked about last week, I do have one of my siblings, one of my sisters is a child psychologist, so I hear a lot from her, in that I see parents kind of excusing child behavior based on, well, you know, it's just the terrible twos. Yes, that 2-year time frame can be very terrible. I also would say there's this thing called the treacherous 3s, but we can't excuse how we respond to some of the conflicts and some of the issues that they're having in that terrible 2s and in the sometimes into the 3s is teaching them about consequences and conflict resolution. And so it's a really important time and isn't something that should just be excused. Hindsight being 20/20, when we look at later delinquents, one of the commonalities that those kids have that at least the parents say is, you know, they showed a lot of aggressive behavior in those early years. It certainly doesn't mean that kids who show early aggression are going to become delinquent, but in hindsight, that's one of those red flags that we can be aware of. Over the next 15 years, basically, obviously, through that adolescence and teenage years, it's a time of tremendous hormone changes. It's a time of great stress for these kids. And one of the worst things you can hear is, "Mom, I'm bored." Research basically has demonstrated that kids who become delinquent, again, have another commonality in that they were bored. And so providing kids opportunities of constructive things to do is one of the key ways to avoid delinquency. Basically, there's this saying out in the field is that busy kids are not delinquent kids. One of the other challenges that kids tend to have, or one of the red flags that can lead to delinquency, is having deviant peers. Friends who are already delinquent will basically bring you in. My dad used to always say, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. as well as rejection by peers, can be a red flag towards delinquency. So in those times, and again, this is just an introduction, these are things that we're going to talk about over the next several weeks, but these are some of the things that we need to pay more attention to in those child development years. All right, the family's influence on delinquency begins with what we refer to as the radial concept. Now, if I can draw your attention, give me just one moment. They did some changes to WebEx, and I'm still trying to remember where my tools are. So I apologize for that delay. All right, so over here, this bullseye is what is referred to as how I like to refer to or conceptualize what is known as the radial concept. Now, some people say it looks like a bullseye. Some people like to say it as a cell development. The cell development is probably the most accurate. However, a bullseye applies as well because ultimately the center of that bullseye is worth the most points. The immediate area around that bullseye is worth still a lot of points, and the points lessen as it goes out. When we look at it as a cell development, that center is that nucleus. The area around the nucleus has the most influence, and then slowly is less influence as we go out of that cell. Now, the radial concept. In this cell, the child is our nucleus, or the child is our bullseye. The area right around that child is the family. It is the most influential factor on a child's development. The yellow area is the school, which also contains their peers, their friends. We see a shift in child development going from the family being most important to their friends and peers being most important. And then the outside is the influence of the community, still important, yet not as influential as, let's say, the family is. So basically, this radial concept is the influence, and again, it is the most intensive, the closest to the nucleus, the closest to our child, and then lessens as we move out. Each of these influences can be both a protective as well as a risk factor. So let me explain what, it's pretty much self-explanatory, but let me explain what we mean by that. Protective factors are things that keep us safe. They're things that insulate us and protect us from becoming delinquent. So having a, functional family, having, two parents involved, steady income, supportive family can be a protective factor. Families can also be a risk factor. Risk factors are self-explanatory. Being in and we'll talk about some of these, being in a one-parent family where there isn't consistent income, or there might be alcohol or substance abuse. All that is risk factor. Same with peers in school. School can be a protective factor, and friends can be a protective factor, keep us away from delinquency. Both can be a risk factor in leading us towards delinquency. Same with community. Community can be a protective factor, have things that supports families and kids, can also be a risk factor. High crime rate, high substance abuse in the community, gangs in the community can be a risk factor. All right, so I want to briefly talk about the categories of family challenges. Now, in your textbook, this is categories of family dysfunction. I really don't like the word dysfunction. I don't believe there is such a thing. I think all families have some level of dysfunction. And so, I say find me a functional family, because I think we all have issues. We all have areas that we can get better. So I like to call this family challenges. Now, the first category of family challenges is basically family breakup. Whether it be divorce. Actually, right now you are more likely to get divorced than you are to stay married. The current divorce rate is higher for divorce than it is for staying married. Blended families is also a challenge. They actually have a higher divorce rate. So we have a family, where the parents are divorced, they marry someone else. So now we have a blended family. That blended family actually has a higher divorce rate than that first-time marriage divorce rate. So basically, divorce is a huge influence on and creates some family challenges. what I think is most interesting about that is we definitely see some gender differences in how they respond to that family breakup. Boys are more prone to delinquency when the father becomes absent. For whatever reason, in that divorce, the father becomes absent or is greatly reduced in the influence it has on that child. So boys are more influenced by an absent father. Girls are more influenced towards delinquency by what we call post-divorce conflict. So whether it be visitation, child support, if the parents just simply can't even be in the same room together, girls are more influenced towards delinquency than boys are with that post-divorce conflict. All right, so the second category is family conflict. So let's say the parents don't divorce. We know all the risks that divorce causes, and so I can't tell you how many times I hear of parents saying, well, we're staying together for the kids. Now, I get that. However, when they don't divorce, sometimes that leads to both verbal and physical abuse. And that can also negatively influence the child. Actually, kids who are witness to abuse or experience abuse are 6 times more likely to become delinquent than kids who don't witness or experience abuse. So we have challenges there as well. The third category is family competence. Now, of course, we know children don't come with a parenting manual. There's no how-to book. Of course, there's resources to help, but there's not like a parenting manual. And so, but ultimately, the parent's ability to parent and how good they are has a definite influence on future delinquency. 2 of the primary things that we look at here is either inconsistent or ineffective supervision. Kids need to be monitored, and they need to be monitored consistently as well as effectively. You know, being in the same room but on your phone, I can't tell you how many times I've been at the park with my kids, and I see the parents are there physically, however, they are in their phone, and they haven't looked up to see what their kid's doing in several minutes. I'm like, honey, your kid could be gone, and just, you know, not monitoring their behavior and what they're doing. Parental efficacy. Efficacy is just a fancy word for efficiency or effectiveness. You know, again, they don't come with a parenting manual, but basically, you know, how good of a job are they doing at parenting? Family deviance is the 4th challenge. Basically, parents who have antisocial behaviors or are criminals, it generally stays in the family. I can't tell you how many, I knew I'd been working in the system a really long time because I started to see the kids of the folks that used to be on my caseload in probation. And so it's definitely a cycle. It's a cycle that needs to be broken, but we generally see it being a cycle in the criminal justice system. All right, so let's focus for just a little bit here on the family. As I already said, the family can be the greatest protective factor as well as the greatest risk factor because, again, on that nucleus, right around the child is the family. The family is the strongest socialization force. They are the teachers on what is expected in society. What are our societal norms and values? It's the family and the parents that are the teachers of that socialization aspect. Again, that ties in with parental efficacy. As I said, we don't come with a manual, but you know, ultimately this is something that begins with the parents. The parents are who teach that socialization process and how to thrive in a society. Kids don't just get values, they need to be taught values. And that often begins with the parents. Do as I say, not as I do is not an effective teaching tool. Kids will follow what they see versus what they hear. So, and I think back when I worked with juveniles, and I was working with this particular kid that kept violating his probation. And he would violate his probation through status offenses, which, so things like smoking and not going to school and being out after curfew. And one of his biggest challenges was smoking. And I was meeting with the mom in the juvenile, and the mom is sitting, we met outside, and the mom is sitting, and I think in our probably 20-minute meeting, she smoked 3 cigarettes and was literally like, you know, I keep telling them don't smoke. I keep telling them it's bad for you, and I'm not dogging smokers at all, but, you know, I keep telling them he shouldn't smoke, and it's bad for you, and it's expensive, and, you know, as she literally chain smoked 3 cigarettes and then handed her son a cigarette. I'm like, wait a minute, you can't do, not in front of me, please, please, not in front of me. So do as I say, not as I do absolutely doesn't work with child development. All right. Some other risk factors through the family. One of the key risk factors is poverty, and your textbook and some of the readings specifically look at homelessness among our poverty population. So ultimately, as a parent who is experiencing homelessness with their children, the stress that homelessness creates is huge. And what we see is that in trying to resolve those homelessness issues, sometimes it leads to child neglect. We leave our kids where they may not be the safest. Sometimes in trying to deal with our homelessness or some of the other issues might lead to child neglect. The stress may also lead to abuse of those children. It's also very stressful for children to be homeless, and ultimately that homelessness can lead to behavior problems in school as well as other issues, which we shouldn't be surprised by. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I have this pyramid on your screen, and basically we see this being kind of reflected in a child's ability to learn. So ultimately, the bottom of that, if a child doesn't have their physiological and their safety needs met, they then can't go to the next level, which is the psychological needs, which is their belongingness, they're feeling like they have a feeling of accomplishment and self-worth. Ultimately, then that leads to self-actualization, and for the most part, this is where learning happens. And so if a child doesn't even have these basic needs met through food, clothing, and shelter, they can't move up Maslow's hierarchy. And so it makes it very, very challenging for children when they are living in homelessness. Poverty also can lead to welfare dependence, and we know kids whose parents are dependent on welfare to raise those kids have much higher delinquency rates than kids who don't. And again, that's all a side factor of poverty. Then, as I already talked about, absent parents and one-parent families. Whether a parent is absent through divorce, incarceration, treatment, whatever reason, we know that that can negatively influence or be a risk factor for future delinquency. Parents who don't have a high school diploma is a huge risk factor. That's why one of the programs we see right now, especially for new parents who don't have a high school diploma or the equivalent, we have programs to help them complete their high school diploma, because we have definite research that says parents who don't have a high school diploma have children who have a much greater risk at future delinquency. So we know there's a correlation there, so now we have preventative programs to try to help those parents get that degree. All right, so moving outside our bullseye or our nucleus or our cell development is the schools and peers. And we know that a whole lot more than learning goes on at schools. This is when we see the values that were initially initiated by the parents being shaped. Now, sometimes if those parents weren't necessarily teaching pro-social or what we might call appropriate values when they were little, sometimes when they get to school, we can shape and shift those. If they were from a negative start. Positive values, we see the school shaping those to become even more positive and more important. And again, in that radio concept, this is when we see a shift from the family being most important to really kind of the friends taking over. I'm dealing with that in my own home. I struggle with it at times, but we know that that's absolutely normal. And so again, surrounding our kids with kids who seem to have the same value system that we do is really important, as long as those values are positive. Ultimately, research has demonstrated that your future economic and social status is going to be based on how well you do and how successful you are in school. Basically, your success in school is positively correlated to your future cash flow coming in. What I think is really interesting and sad at the same time is the United States is one of the, if not the most wealthy countries in the world. The paradox of that is that we don't rank highest, not even close to highest, in what we spend on education. And I think that's really, really sad. Some states, such as California, actually spend more on incarceration than they do on education. Think if that would be switched. So we have countries that are tremendously less wealthy than the United States is, but spend significant more on education. And I see that as a major problem that we have. Some of the other issues in education, we know that the problems begin very early. A recent study said that 1 out of 5 kids are unprepared for kindergarten, do not have the skills and the resources, know-how to be ready for kindergarten. And when we take that a step further and look at who those kids are, many of them are from poverty homes. This is why we've seen the recent push for Head Start and preschool programs, especially from families who are either at or below the poverty level. We really have a push towards preschool and Head Start programs to help them become better prepared for kindergarten. Truancy, so not going to school, is the most frequent status offense for kids under age 15. Minnesota, kind of tooting my own horn, so I'm from Minnesota. We have what are known as Minnesota compulsory attendance laws. We require our kids go to school until at least the age of 18 or get their GED, where other states allow kids to drop out at 16. And so when you think about that and the paradox that we have there, so the fact that truancy is the most frequent status offense for under 15 is kind of a catch-22 because after 16, many states don't require them to go to school anymore. Minnesota, we require our kids to stay longer, and so we are tracking truancy rates longer, yet we still rank second lowest. Minnesota is very, very innovative on how we deal with truancy and how we fight truancy, for lack of better terms, and how we really work to keep kids, to get kids to school and to keep them in school. And so Minnesota's doing a lot of things right. Why we focus so much on truancy and the new math, I'm actually struggling with how my kids are learning math. I totally get that there's lots of research, and so I'm supportive of it. It's just very different than how I was taught math. Where ultimately kids who are truant, when they're not at school, they have higher failure rates. You can't learn if you're not there. Kids who have high fail rates tend to drop out. Dropping out of school leads to delinquency issues as well as other psychological and mental health issues. And so that's why we focus so much on getting kids to school and helping kids be successful in school. The federal government is really focused on that, and because of that, they have partnered with the Department of Education. So the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention partnered with the Department of Education to work towards truancy prevention. To do that, they created what is known as the National Center for School Engagement. And so ultimately, this partnership really focuses on what they refer to as the 3 A's, and I'll show you a visual of this in just a moment, but bear with me. So the first A is attendance. Again, focusing on keeping kids not truant, because ultimately you can't learn if you're not there. Yes, they can send your homework home, but it's not the same as being there. But we need to take that a step further and have attachment. Kids need to be connected to someone or something at their school, whether it be a teacher or a program or a staff member. Kids need to be attached to something at school. And then kids need to have achievement. Kids who see success are successful. The No Child Left Behind Act definitely had problems, but ultimately the focus was good, because we know that kids who see success, even if it's tiny steps, baby steps, their successes need to be celebrated, because kids who see success become successful. But we can't stop with just the 3 A's. We need to combine that in a bigger picture. We need the community's help. The school can't do it alone. There needs to be community support to achieve these 3 A's. We need the family involved. It's not like you just send your kids to school and then, expect them to be successful in their education. And then we also need quality programs at our schools. When we can take all of that, basically, we can see success, or it equals success. And so here's basically the National Center for School Engagement. Basically, this is right in their logo, their motto, and it's bringing all 3 of these A's and then the other pieces together to be successful. We can't do it alone. It's not just the school. It's not the school's fault that a child is not successful. We need that bigger picture to be or have success at the school. All right, shifting gears now. One of my favorite things that we are doing in the juvenile justice system is what is known as a risk and needs assessment. It's known as the YLSI. CMI, Case Management Inventory, came later. The YLSI was built after the LSI, which was the Level of Service Inventory, which is a tool that we use for adults to assess their risks and needs. That tool was modified to become the YLSI to address youth specifically. And ultimately, we assess their risks, we assess their needs, and that's how we make our decisions on how we're going to move forward with this youth to help their youth, to help the child based on the risk and needs that were assessed. Now, in your lessons folder is an introduction to evidence-based practices. The YLSI is evidence-based practices. It's using data to make our decisions, and ultimately that is what our system is really leaning towards. Please make sure you're reading that introduction to evidence-based practices. It's going to be important for the completion of your writing assignment this week, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right, back to the YLSI. Basically, the YLSI is based on several different principles. The first is assessing risk. And of course, it's important that we don't assess risk too high, because if we assess someone as being a high risk, we may not want to refer to them some programming that will help them because we think they're too much of a risk, but that program could really help. Vice versa, if we assess risk too low and they're more of a risk, we might put them in programs that are not appropriate because their risk was not assessed right. We also need to assess their needs. These are areas that this child needs help. Now, we know that there are dynamic needs, in fact, dynamic factors and static factors. So let me do those in reverse order. Static factors are things that are definitely an influence to a child, but we can't necessarily do anything else. They're in the history, or they are things that we can't really do anything about, but we certainly are going to take that in consideration in our assessing needs. So a child who has a learning disability, obviously we can take that in consideration and help them process through that, but that's really a static factor that we can't do anything about. A dynamic factor are factors that are current and we can change, we can influence. A child is currently dealing with substance abuse. They are an addict. We can get them into a treatment program, so that's a dynamic factor. We can do something about that. And ultimately with this, we also need to focus on what their strengths are. What are they good at? What's a positive in their life? And make sure we're always taking that in consideration. We also need to be responsive. Responsivity is basically taking into consideration and building our plan to help this kid based on their learning style. You know, if a child does have a learning disability, how can we create a plan that's going to take that into consideration, in that our intervention needs to be kind of based on how that child best learns. We also have the ability to override. We know kids lie. And although this tool has pieces built into it to allow us to manage some of those, what might be lies, we're always verifying the information when we can that the child gives us, but we still have discretion in that if I find that the child wasn't being truthful, I can override it and kind of work that plan into what I'm seeing as far as based on my discretion. So let's take a look. So now the YLSI is a computerized program. So basically I just open up an app on my desktop, and when I'm meeting with a kid, I go through and I'm just clicking. Of course I can't show you that in this platform, so what I did was basically make a hard copy of, this is how we used to do it in the olden days, when we didn't have the computer, the app to do the assessment. So basically part one is the assessment of risks and needs. And so we have several different sections or several different factors that we assess for. The first is their prior interaction with the juvenile justice system as, you know, and what was the result of them? How many times? Have they been in a detention center? Where are they? Where do they fall in this? Basically, whatever you know, whatever check we mark, you know, A, B, we mark it, and then that will be tabulated later. It's going to assess it. So, how many do we mark? If it's low, if we don't mark any, they've never been in the juvenile justice system, then that would be a low. And actually, then we would call that a strength, saying, you know what, this is your first offense. It doesn't have to be your future. So we assess it either low, moderate, or high based on how many boxes we've checked. All right, then we go into family circumstances and parenting. How many of these apply? Again, if none, then it's a strength, saying your family is awesome. Your family is doing their best to try to help you, and we're going to use that as a strength. Or based on how many is it low, moderate, or high. Again, the computer system is automatically going to assess that for us. We used to have to do it by hand. All right, education and employment, obviously depending on the age, how many do these apply? If they're doing really well in school, they're still in school. If they have a job and are keeping that job, it's a strength. Otherwise, we're going to assess it low, moderate, or high. Peer relations, again, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. You know, are their peers delinquent? You know, if they're not, that's a strength, or we assess the risk level. The next area is substance abuse. You know, is it low, medium, or high? What do we assess that as, or is it a strength? All right, why is it not letting me go to page 2? All right, there we go. All right, the 6th is leisure and recreation. What do they do for fun? And is it legal, for lack of better terms? We also assess their personality and behavior, and attitudes and orientation, nothing to do with their sexual orientation at this point, but how is their orientation towards society and their attitudes towards society and others. All right, then part 2 is where we mark those out, you know, and where they were assessed at low, moderate, or high. We have an overall total. And then part 3 is assessment of other needs and special considerations. You know, where this, if they have identified as LGBT or alternative orientation, we are going to assess that here. Other problems where these don't fall under those first 8 categories, but have an impact, and so we're going to be assessing them here. All right, then the next page is obviously we're going to, based on an override, this is that professional discretion. A lot of times that's going to be no, but it can be yes. And then part 5 is based on their risk levels. What level of supervision are we going to recommend? Then we come up with a case plan. And so I referenced my dad a lot. My dad had a lot of sayings and kind of those life lessons things. And one of his sayings that he used to like to say was, if your job is to eat an elephant, how are you going to do it? And his answer was bite by bite. Of course, if we approach something that's huge, like an elephant, and we need to eat it all, if we look at it holistically, it's overwhelming. But if we take it bite by bite, pretty soon we're going to have that elephant eaten, right? At least that was my dad's philosophy. And so part 6 is the case plan, where ultimately we have outcomes. So let's say one of our outcomes is that you are going to get your high school diploma or equivalency. Okay, when you talk to a kid that dropped out in 7th grade or is testing at a 4th and 5th grade level, that's really, really overwhelming. And so although that might be our outcome, we're going to break that down into specific goals. So this specific goal, we might start with, okay, we're going to go to the community education or wherever our GED classes are held at, and we're going to make an appointment for them to do an academic assessment. That's our first goal. And then they're going to tell us, you know, what their recommendations are and get us enrolled. Then the specific goals is we're going to start going to classes and working with tutors or whatever it might be. And then the third goal is we're going to figure out where do we need to go, what do we need to do to take that GED test. And so we break it down into tiny steps. So yes, our outcome is getting that GED, but we need to break it down into steps to make it more palpable. You know, students or kids are going to be much more willing, even adults. We do the same thing for adults. So outcome might be to get you sober. But again, for someone that's deep in their addiction, that's really overwhelming. So this first goal might be, we're going to do a chemical dependency assessment and figure out what you need there. And then we're going to get you connected to a treatment program and come up with a plan, whether it be inpatient, outpatient, you know, when the meetings are, what you need. Goal 3 is to follow through with that treatment plan. You know, and then ultimately get you sober. And you know, if there's another outcome, getting a job, you know, do we need some training? Where do we need to go? What do we need to do? And we're going to break that down into those specific goals. And again, we even have room for outcome 4, depending on what this kid's goals are, what their needs are. All right, then lastly, of course, we'll all sign off. Once we figure out what those goals are, we all sign off. Basically, this is our signature that, yep, we agree with this, and we are ready to move forward. And you see, we even have the family signing off on it. Oops, why do I have it here? Okay, so this next part is then how we monitor, and again, now it's all computerized, how we are monitoring how they're doing. Sometimes it's a change in a risk level. You know, depending on their substance abuse, if they were, you know, high when they first came to us and are now sober and are passing their UAs in their drug tests, we might have a decrease in there. And so this is kind of just how we monitor what we're seeing and how we're progressing in those outcomes. You know, and then depending on how the child progresses, the overall rating, where we're at, if we need to reassess their risk levels, you know, are they achieving their outcomes? This is how we keep track of it. If they're non-compliant, why, what was going on? So we keep track of that. And then lastly, the case closure. So, you know, whether they close because they met all their goals and they're no longer on probation or need our services, or do they reoffend and so they're back in a detention center, so this plan is null and void and we move to another plan. But again, this is an absolutely awesome tool that we use to really have evidence-based practices and using data and risk and needs assessment, which is something that we're going to talk about, again, all term, to make our decisions on. All right, so the first part of the code is going to be the word risk. So you need that for attendance of this live lecture. All right, let's take a look at the assignments this week. So your readings. So you need to read chapters 7 and 8 in your ebook, and then there's also 2 chapters linked under, so in that lessons folder under assignments, you're going to see the 2, chapters 7 and 8. Then you're going to see 2 chapters in a separate ebook that are linked. You need to read those as well. Make sure you read the lecture notes on child development and evidence-based practices, and then do the practice activity. All of that is fair game for the quiz. The writing assignment. Again, make sure you're reading that evidence-based practices section in the lessons folder. I really like this writing assignment. You get to be the caseworker for Callie. So you're going to read the scenario about Callie and then use the factor template. It's a Word document that you click on. You fill that out in the name, so you don't need a title page for this one, but where it is the name, don't put Callie, put your own name, so I know whose paper I'm reading. Basically, you need to identify 3 risks and 2 protective factors for each area, and that will be evident once you open that factor template. Make sure you're not just giving, I don't need complete sentences, but I also don't want to see one word. Think if you were doing, think if you're the caseworker. If I put, you know, drugs under a risk factor, is that going to cut it? Absolutely not. So make sure, you know, if you're doing the risk factor of, you know, something about dad's drug use, make sure you're thorough. The rubric is in the announcements. I posted an announcement on Monday. The rubric of how the points are distributed for that assignment are listed there. The discussion forum, you're actually going to watch one of my favorite documentaries called Tough Guys by Dr. Jackson Katz. And basically, so you need to watch the documentary first, and then you need to answer the 5 questions based on what you saw in the documentary as well as your own opinions. So that's your initial post. Your response post then is going to be to a student who answered differently, and you need to compare and contrast your responses. The quiz this week, you need to answer 25 questions, and you have 50 minutes to do it. Similar to last week, that's not enough time to look up all the information, so make sure you are well prepared, that you've taken notes on the readings, made an outline, and study that outline to prepare for the quiz. For the project, nothing is due this week. However, make sure you're working on that outline. The outline is due next week, and it will certainly sneak up on you. So make sure, again, in the announcements as well as the project description from last week, so whatever topic you choose, you need to look to research the history, the current status, 2 benefits, 2 drawbacks, and then your opinion. No matter what your topic is, that's how you need to approach it. This project requires that you have a minimum of 3 scholarly sources. Now, you can have more sources than that. Like, for instance, if you're doing it on the DARE program, you can use dare.org. However, that's not one of your scholarly source requirements. You need to have 3 scholarly sources from our library database. So let me show you. I'm just actually going to share my screen real quick and go to our class. All right, so this is our class right now. Mine might look just a little bit different than yours does. Let me move my my screen out of the way. So a couple things I want to draw your attention to. And sharing my screen, I don't have my little tools. But look over here where it says need help. So I have quick links to some of my favorite help tools that we have. For instance, Grammarly. If you notice that in your week 1 submission, I noted all your spelling errors and grammar sentence structure errors, sentence fragments, those types of things. You can submit your papers through Grammarly. It's instantaneous and will give you feedback on your spelling as well as lack of citation and other issues. If you need to meet with a tutor for help with writing, help doing, studying for exams, you can meet with a tutor. If you don't know how to use our library databases, you can schedule a 20-minute appointment with Dennis, our librarian, School of Justice librarian, and he will help you navigate our databases to help you find the 3 scholarly sources. If you look up here under the Resources tab, if you click on the Resources tab, this is where you get the APA guide. If you need help with the title page, in-text citation, all of that is going to be under the APA guide. Grammarly is that proofing service that I just talked about. First time you use it, you need to set up an account. Noodle Tools will help you create a reference page in APA format. Searching e-resources and articles. This is basically where you get to our library databases. And again, the librarian, for example, can help you with this. Some of my favorites, I like if you scroll down to ease, I like the EBSCO Megafile is one of my favorite databases, but again, there's a ton. And if that's overwhelming to you, you can meet with the librarian and he will he can help you with that. So here is how you can schedule to meet with our librarian. Click right here. You want to meet with Dennis Johnson, and then it's going to bring up his schedule. And so, again, I really encourage you to utilize his availability. If you don't know how to use our library databases or you're struggling finding scholarly research, schedule an appointment to meet with Dennis, and he is available to help you. All right. Lastly, if you haven't already, only a couple of you have, please introduce yourself in the student lounge. Take a look at me, get to know I am a real life person with a real life and family and history. So get to know me a little bit better, and then introduce yourself as well. For those of you that have, thank you. Thanks to those of you that have included a picture. It helps me put kind of a face to see that you're a real life person as well. All right. For the second part of the code for today's lecture is the word needs. So that's all I have for you. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to call me. I'm here to help. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.